Hi, I'm Gary Stafford, AWS Area Principal Solutions Architect, a member of the AWS Analytics Technical Field Community, and a generative AI specialist at AWS. You can get a hold of me on LinkedIn, GitHub, Medium, Twitter, and YouTube at Gary Stafford. The following video is based on a blog post I recently published, Mastering Long Document Insights, Advanced Summarization with Amazon Bedrock and Anthropic Claude Foundation Models. The blog post is published on both Medium and LinkedIn. The links are included here, along with a QR code. Please like, subscribe, and follow me on Medium and YouTube, and let's connect on LinkedIn. The code is also available on GitHub. Here we have the Medium blog post. The exact copy of this is also available on LinkedIn if you don't use Medium. In the spirit of the season, since I released this right around Halloween, we're going to analyze Dracula. The Dracula novel, along with many other novels, are freely available through Project Gutenberg. Links are in the blog post. The source code is also available on GitHub. There's a link in the articles to the GitHub site. The GitHub site has a number of scripts. It has the sample input, Dracula. It also has the sample output, which I'll explain in a minute. Since publishing the article, I've also created a SageMaker notebook, and that's what we're going to be using today to walk through as part of this video. The notebook, along with all the original scripts, are available in the GitHub repo. Everything is open source and available to use. The article walks through a number of examples of using Anthropic Claude version 2 of the model with a 100,000 token context window available through Amazon Bedrock. So we'll be using Amazon Bedrock along with Anthropic Claude v2 foundation model. And we're going to be analyzing the Dracula novel, the original Dracula novel. Most often when you see summarization of long text documents like the novel, they're generally summary of summary. So we break the long novel, in this case the long text, apart into different sections. We create summaries of each section, and then we create an overall summary of that larger text. We're going to be doing that, but we're also going to be looking at other ways that we can analyze large text and some creative ways to use the advanced prompting capabilities of the Anthropic Claude models. I'm going to jump over into my notebook. So again, I'm going to be using SageMaker Studio. If you're not familiar with Studio, Studio is a fully functional machine learning IDE available from AWS. You can also run this notebook from your own local environment. You could run it in PyCharm. You could run it in Visual Studio. I just happen to be running it in SageMaker Studio. It gives me quick and ready access to Amazon Bedrock. I don't have to worry about any infrastructure. It's all serverless. And since I'm already in SageMaker, connecting to Bedrock securely and safely and in a performant manner is very easy. But again, nothing prevents you from running all of this locally. So we're going to go over to the Amazon SageMaker notebook that I've created. This is a Jupyter notebook, a scientific notebook. All the samples that are in the blog post are included in this notebook, along with some additional more advanced prompting techniques that I've used, and I'll explain those as we go along. So if you follow along with the notebook in this video, there's 4 or 5 additional different types of prompts that I'm using with the long text of the Dracula novel, and some advanced prompting techniques that you'll learn beyond just the article itself. To get started, there's minimal packages to install, so the notebook starts by pip installing the required packages. There is a requirements file. Again, the requirements are pretty minimal. We're going to be loading the Anthropic module, the Boto 3 Python library for AWS, and the Boto Core library in case we throw any errors. We'll pip install those from the requirements file, and then we can just check to make sure they're loaded at the time of this video. These were the latest versions. Anthropic was just updated from 0.5 to 0.6. You will need the most recent versions of Boto 3 and Boto Core in order to use Amazon Bedrock. There were some recent changes when Bedrock went GA in September. Next, we'll go ahead and import the packages that we need. So I've already installed the packages for the sake of time. We'll just import those. Now there's a lot of different ways that we could split the book apart. We could use LangChain, Llama Index. There's a number of common libraries out there. The challenge with some of those techniques is it's kind of blindly splitting the long text apart. You give it a chunk size, you give it an overlap, you give it the type of character that you want to break on. And oftentimes that will work, right? So we might break on a sentence, we could break on a paragraph, we might break on a page. But since we have a novel, and in this case, the Gutenberg ebook format for Dracula has chapter headings, so it calls out each chapter. We can do a simple regex and we can split on the chapter heading, and we're going to end up with 27 chapters. We have a method, we'll pass in the entire text, we'll split that apart into 27 different chapters, and then those chapters are what we're going to be passing into Anthropic to do our summarization. And then if we want, we can do summary of summaries to then summarize the individual chapter content that we extract. The next thing we're going to want to do is actually load in the Dracula novel. So I've included that in the GitHub project. You can also go to Project Gutenberg and download Dracula along with hundreds of other long texts if you want to try those out. Dracula was the first one I picked, and since it was Halloween, it seemed appropriate. So we went ahead and we loaded Dracula. We passed that into our function. The function split that up into chapters, and now we have all the chapters. And just for a quick sample, I'll just print out the first 2,048 characters of the first chapter. So this is the type of text that we're going to be analyzing. The next thing I did is went ahead and performed some analysis on the long text just to kind of understand what we have and the length of each chapter, how many characters, how many words, how many paragraphs, how many tokens, and then understanding the character to token ratio. So generally speaking, and we'll get into the Anthropic documentation in a minute, Anthropic states that generally that ratio is 3.5 characters for every token, and we can see that we're very close to that. The exact number or the average number of tokens, the average number of characters per token is going to depend on the type of text. In this case, it's slightly more, so we're about 4 characters for every token, and we'll see that. So we'll do a little bit of analysis here. I'll run that and show you the results. So we can see that we have, again, 27 chapters. We can see how many paragraphs we have, so I've split it by paragraph. I've also split it by word, so we can see the number of words, and we'll look at the min, max, average, and sum in a moment. Also look at the number of characters, and then we can get the number of tokens. Now, in order to get the number of tokens, that's why I imported the Anthropic library. Anthropic has a count tokens function. So Anthropic is my client. I've called the Anthropic client count tokens. I've passed in each chapter and I've gotten back the number of tokens. I can then divide the number of characters by the number of tokens and get a ratio. So you can see that it's approximately 4. We'll look at the average in a minute, the min-max and average of that. And then we can get a cost. So this is the cost per chapter. If I were to pass this entire chapter into the Anthropic Claude V2 model using Amazon Bedrock or on Amazon Bedrock, this would be the cost. And then there's just a few additional tokens, obviously, because the chapter is part of a template. So what we're going to do is we're going to call Anthropic Claude, and for the different functions, we're going to be passing each chapter in a loop. We're going to be getting back some information, and then we're going to be summarizing each one of those chapters in a text document. And I'll show you what that looks like after we do a few of these. So we have the chapter, the paragraphs, words, characters, tokens, the ratio of characters to tokens, and what the cost is going to be on Amazon Bedrock. Let's go ahead and run one more analysis, and this will be a little clearer. So here we can see some totals. The raw book, the Dracula novel, we can see the total paragraphs, characters, words, and tokens. And I just want to call attention to this. So the entire raw text is 211,000 tokens approximately. Now there is a preface to that, and there's also some text after the end. So we're going to cut that off. So that's not going to be the total size that we work with. It's going to be slightly smaller than that. I'll show you that in a minute. But again, we have 27 chapters. We can see the min, max, average, and sum of the paragraphs, the words, the characters, the tokens. Just to call attention to this. So these are the total tokens. So if you pass in all the chapters, we're going to be passing in about 205,200, let's call it 206,000 tokens into Claude in order to do these different analysis and summarization of the novel across the 27 chapters. We can see here the ratio of characters to tokens. So right around about 4.05 characters per token. A lot of people ask, well, how big is a token? Anthropic in their documentation, we'll look at that in a minute too, says it's about 3.5, I believe, with this particular text and the style of the text, the content. So we're right around 4 characters per token. For every token that we're paying for in Bedrock, that's equivalent of about 4 characters. And then we can just see a total cost here. So I'll just skip down. If we were to pass in the entire, let's call it 206,000 tokens, that's going to cost us about $2.27. And you can round that up a little bit because, again, the prompt that we're passing in, the prompt template, has a little bit of instruction, pretty minor instruction. The bulk of that's going to be the chapter that we pass in, one chapter at a time. But again, $2.27 to pass all 27 chapters in for a total of 206,000 tokens. That just gives us a better sense of what we're working with. And when we talk about a long text, even if we split this in half, we still couldn't pass it all in. So at minimum, we'd have to split this into 3 parts in order to pass it all in. But then there's a lot of disadvantage of that, like how do I split the novel? So again, we're going to stick with this chapters. The chapters are broken down into 27 chunks, and within each one of those chunks are chapters, pieces of text. They're semantically related because they are a chapter. So hopefully we'll get good summaries or good analysis out of each chapter that we can then combine to do summary of summaries and some other methods on that. To continue down, we're going to start performing some analysis. So the first thing I need to do is create connection to Amazon Bedrock. So I'm going to import Bodo 3 and then Bodo Core for some exceptions if we get some errors. Because the request payload and the response payload through the API, we're calling the Python Bodo 3 API for Bedrock. We're passing in a JSON format payload. We're getting back a JSON format payload. So I'm also importing the JSON package. So we'll create our client. And then I've created a function here. We pass in the prompt, so the final prompt, the instructions plus the chapter, some additional information. I'll show you that in a moment. We format that properly. Now, we could adjust these. I'm going to go with the same input or inference configuration for Anthropic Claude v2. Also note for the prompt, so when I show you the prompts, what they're going to be lacking is this initial return human, and then at the end there is the return assistant. And this is required, so any prompt that we pass in specifically to the Anthropic Claude model, we need to start every prompt with this return or /n human, and we need to end that with a similar one for assistant. We're going to be doing a max token to sample a return of 4,000. The temperature, we're going to be using 0.2, so I'm trying to keep it as close to 0 as possible. The challenge with getting it higher than that and making it too creative or going more towards 1 is that the summaries that we get back or the analysis may not be factual, so it may start hallucinating. So I want to give it a little bit of creativity, but I also want to go too high where I have to be concerned the information I'm getting back is maybe not accurate. We're going with fairly default settings for top K and top P, and then we do have a stop sequence, and this is again a requirement for Anthropic Claude v2. Each model or each model provider has different requirements. This is a hard requirement. So again, we need to start with human, we need to end with assistant, the prompt is in the middle, and we do need to indicate that the stop sequence is human. So just make sure if you want to use a different model, and you certainly can, especially given the size of the chapters, you could use a smaller context window model. Just make sure that you configure this properly, including the key values will also change for different models. So just this is really what you'll have to configure if you decide to change the model. Everything else should be fairly generic to the model you choose. Again, just setting up the call, we get the response back by calling the Bedrock invoke model method. Again, we're calling the Anthropic Claude v2, so that's a model ID, pretty straightforward. Bedrock makes it very easy. AWS has made it very easy to use Amazon Bedrock and call the different models by simply changing the model ID plus the minimal configuration provided by the model provider that's required. Once we get the response body back, so again, it's going to be passing in a JSON request body. We're going to get a JSON format response body back, and we just want to parse that out. So we just want to get the body, we'll read that in, and then we'll return that. The only other thing that I'm doing here, generally when you get these back, it will start with a line like, here are 3 hypothetical questions the passage could answer. Here are the summaries of each chapter. So because we're doing 27 chapters, I don't want to see this line 27 times. So all I'm doing is kind of chopping off. If that first line, if I can split it, and that first line is more of a general summary of what was requested, I just chop that out. So all I'm getting back is the actual answer that I've asked for, a summary of a chapter, a list of main characters, a list of character types, etc. And you'll see that as we go through. So this is just chopping off that first line if it exists, just to kind of reduce the response that comes back, and it makes it easier when we're doing summarizations later. Now that we have that and I've run that, let's just look at some basic prompting, right? And this is where prompt engineering is so critical. Starting with the minimal prompt that I could pass into the Anthropic Claude v2 model, have something very simple here, right? Write a short summary of the following chapter. And then I would pass in a chapter, in this case, chapter 0, we'll just pass in one chapter, and I can print the response, right? So if we do that, let's take a look and see what that looks like. It should just take a second. If this looks like it's taking a long time, you're like, wow, this seems a little slow. Think about the fact that we're passing in an entire text to a large language model, and we're asking that large language model to summarize up to 30,000 characters or 10,000 tokens, right? That's not a simple task. In fact, that was pretty responsive, and we did get a response back. If you were thinking, hey, this doesn't look like a summary, it's bullet pointed, that's because we didn't ask for anything very specific, right? We just said write a short summary. We didn't say make it a paragraph, make it 2 paragraphs, use bullets, use numbers, right? We weren't specific. So we're getting something back, but we shouldn't expect something more specific if we're not explicit in our summary, or in our prompt. And that's where prompt engineering comes in. So you'll see as we continue to evolve these prompts, as we go through the examples, our prompts will get more precise, and that gives us the ability to control the output. It also gives us the ability to use different large language models. Because here's the problem. If I, let's say, want to try out 3 or 4 different large language models and I pass this prompt in, maybe one of those models gives me back something I was expecting, and suddenly I decide, well, that model's better than the other 3. Well, really, it's not better than the other 3, or not necessarily better than the other 3. It just happened to give you back the response that you wanted, but you didn't give it a lot of instruction. You're better off giving it more instruction, and then you can properly evaluate different large language models. So my recommendation before you decide whether or not a large language model is right for your use case is make sure that you do a lot of prompt engineering and really fine tune your prompt, and then it'll give you the ability to test a number of large language models and get back consistent results, and then you can evaluate the quality of the results. So that was a very simple prompt, about as simple as it can get. And again, remember that when we pass in this prompt, we're going to wrap this prompt in the \n or return human. And then in the end, we're going to be adding the return assistant. And our stop sequence is the return humans. So we got that back. Not bad, accurate, but maybe not what we expected. What if we wanted to get back just a single paragraph, right? We just want a brief summary. We don't want bullet points. So we can be a little more precise. Here's one. Write a concise, grammatically correct single paragraph summary of the following chapter. So all I've done is be a little more explicit in exactly what I want to get back. So let's try that and see what we get. So that time took a few seconds and we got back a single paragraph. So we won't go in and we won't read this exactly, but let's just assume that it's accurate based on the temperature we set, based on our instructions. We got back what we expected. Now, hey, that's kind of short. It's too long. It's too short. It's not descriptive enough. Again, we got back what we asked for. Although it's a simple example, you may have other examples. You get more complex examples. I have my initial instructions. I pass in my chapter. I might have an example of what I want to get back. I might also have a template. So I might have instructions. I might have a template, and we'll see that later on in some of the more advanced prompts that we create. I might have a template for the way I want to format that in the response, and again, some examples. So here, just a simple example. In order to kind of demarcate different sections of this, we could generically add in this instructions or chapters. Now, this isn't specific to Anthropic Claude v2. Actually, Anthropic Claude v2 in their documentation, and we can take a look at that, has some very specific ways that it's optimized to look for these different sections. But generally speaking, across large language models, you see this technique used. So let's run this. We're going to get back similar results. It won't be the exact same results because our temperature is not zero. It's not deterministic. So we're going to get back a different answer. But what this is trying to do is just, if nothing more than visually, here's my instructions, here's the chapter. We're just trying to help the large language model understand what we're asking for a little better. So we got back a very similar example. Sometimes this can avoid problems where the model doesn't understand where the instructions end and the example or the context, where the context we're passing in begins. So here's our fourth prompt, and this is going to be the prompt that we're going to use. So write a concise, grammatically correct, single paragraph summary of the main points, events, and ideas contained within the chapter XML tags below. With Claude v2, it's optimized to look for these, some people might refer to them as HTML tags or XML tags, and you can demarcate different sections. I don't need one for the instructions. I always start with the instructions, or generally that's what you see with Anthropic. But if I have a template, if I have examples, if I have the context or the text, in this case it's the chapters, I can use these tags, and then I actually call those out, right? I actually point out, hey, below within the chapter XML tags is the stuff that I want you to consider when you're writing your summary. I've also added some instructions to the assistant. This is also something that's discussed in the Anthropic documentation. In this case, we say the assistant should refrain from using bullet point lists. That's something you'll get quite often if you're not explicit and you just ask for a summary, and we saw that in our first example. We'll get back this bullet point format. So we don't want bullet point format, even though in our last two examples we didn't get it. By telling the assistant we don't want it, we're just ensuring that we're not going to get that, or the odds are going to be better that we don't get it back. We also want the assistant to refrain from using these XML tags. Sometimes Anthropic Claude 2 and other models will get confused, and a lot of it's not necessarily confused. Again, it goes back to the precision of your prompt. Depending on exactly how you phrase it, sometimes you'll see these XML tags end up in the answer. So just trying to kind of reinforce with the model, don't include the XML tags in your response. Occasionally it will happen, but this will prevent that in a lot of cases. So again, I don't expect to get anything different back than the last two examples. We're going to get a paragraph back, but I've given it more instruction. I've been more precise. I'm more confident that that answer is going to be exactly what I want. And again, I got a paragraph back, whether that's longer or shorter than their example. Again, I didn't tell it how long to make the paragraph. I just said to be concise. That will hopefully determine the length of the paragraph. But again, I did get a paragraph back. This is kind of the minimal quality of the prompt that I use with Anthropic. And then what we're going to see as we move along is we're going to keep adding to this and making these more precise. The next thing we want to do, we're going to use that same technique. I'm going to loop through all the chapters, and I'm going to get a summary for each chapter. Once I do that, then I'm going to do what's referred to as a summary of summaries. So I'm going to take each one of those individual summaries of chapters 1 through 27, and then I'm going to ask, again, the large language model, Anthropic Claude v2, summarize all these into a single summary. For the sake of time, you can see down here, that's why I have the start time and the finish time. We can see that that took somewhere around 10 minutes. So on average, if we pass all 27 chapters in one at a time, we ask the model to do some form of analysis on that text. That average 30,000 characters, let's call it 7,000 tokens. You'll see that takes about, on average, between 9 and 12 minutes is what I find if there's not a lot going on. In order to save time, I've already run a lot of these. And what we get back, if we go back, and all of these are included in the GitHub project, we have the output folder. I originally started with scripts for the blog post, but I've since created this notebook, so I have all of these. And if we look at the output, we can see here that we have Dracula chapter. So all these start with Dracula, then they're kind of go along with each one. These are all the things that we're going to look at in this notebook. and we have the chapter summary. So this is the first thing that we've run, and we can see here, so I've labeled them. I said, give me the chapter number, give me the description. And we can see here that we ran that. It took about 9 minutes. We passed all 27 chapters in. And I now have 27 chapter summaries of each chapter. You can see there that they vary in length. Oftentimes you'll see little anomalies. Most of these are one paragraph. They vary in length. You can see for some reason on chapter 18, it actually created 3 different sections. Some of that's very hard to control. You can try and get more precise in your prompting, but that's not a problem. What we wanted was a summary of each chapter. And then what we're going to do is take all those summaries and ask the large language model to analyze those and create a single summary. And we're going to use a couple different techniques to get different types of summaries out of that. That's what we got out of running the first one. So now we have 27 summaries. The next thing we're going to do is the first summary of summaries that we're going to do is just a basic summary, right? So write a concise, grammatically correct summary. I didn't say one paragraph, so I'm leaving it up to the large language model how long it wants to be. A grammatically correct summary using the following information within the text. It took me a while to get this just right. I said, of the novel within the text, of the novel within the summary. It was doing a bit of not exactly what I wanted. The output wasn't what I wanted. I just continued to refine this, and this seems to be working pretty good. Again, just telling it not to use bullet points, don't include XML tags, seem to work best, changing these to just text. So I read in the results of the last one. I read that file back in, and then I ask it to create a summary of that. And we can see that here. So if we go to the summary of summaries, we now have a pretty succinct 1-paragraph summary of the entire Dracula novel. So all 27 paragraphs, and you can decide whether or not you think this is accurate. If it's not accurate, you need to prompt it a little different in how to consider what a summary of a novel is, exactly what should be in a summary of a novel. We got back a 1-chapter summary. So that is a summary of summaries. And that's the most common use case that you see with large language models for summarizing long documents. So we're able to summarize a Dracula novel in 1 paragraph. We certainly could have asked for a longer summary. We just asked for a concise summary, so we got this paragraph format back. So the next technique I use, which is pretty similar, but what if we did want bullet points? So in this use case, I actually ask it to create a bulleted list of 3 or 4 main points, events, or ideas based on the different summaries of each chapter in the book, so all 27 chapters. And again, just don't use XML response. Got back a pretty good description, so if we look at that. The Anthropic Claude V2 model, large language models in general, don't always follow numbers. So if you say, give me exactly 3 or give me 4, sometimes you'll get it. Sometimes, again, it's just the way you write the prompt that makes a difference. In this case, I said 3 to 4. Looks like I got about 8 here. But again, it's pretty much the summary that we got in paragraph form, but it's broken that down into bullets. So if you're looking for a quick bulleted list of trying to summarize a long text document, whether that's a novel, maybe it's a long insurance form or legal document, fiction or nonfiction, it doesn't really matter on the type of document. Oftentimes you may want bullets versus a written summary. So you can also do that. And again, it just comes down to how you prompt the model. One less example here and we'll move on. I thought this was kind of fun. So Bram Stoker, he was a Victorian era writer. So what I did is I kind of gave the model a persona, and you see this technique used quite often, write the following response like a pirate. In this case, I thought it'd be interesting, since this book was written by a Victorian era novelist, why don't we actually write the summary in that Victorian era of writing style? So if you've read a lot of books that have come from the Victorian era, there's certainly a particular way of writing and grammar that is used. We can create a persona. Again, didn't go into a lot of detail, really didn't describe what Victorian era means. The large language model seems to understand that. In most cases, you'd probably go into a little more detail and really describe more specifically what you expect when we say Victorian era, but it worked pretty good. Doing the same thing, your Victorian era author, Bram Stoker, in a Victorian era writing style, compose a book summary using the following information. Again, don't use bullet points, don't include XML tags. Very similar to above, just trying to add in a little style to this, changing that summary from a very accurate but somewhat dry summary, and then giving it a little bit of personality and writing it the way maybe the author would have written that summary of the novel. So we can see that here. Now, again, I wasn't very exacting and I want 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs. So it gave me back a really nice 3-paragraph summary, and I won't go into it, but if you have a chance to read this, it's in the GitHub repo. You kind of get that sense, right? It's not the typical straightforward mechanical summary that I got with the other 2 examples. It is a little more creative. It's a little more in the style of maybe what you would expect from the Victorian era, a writer who's writing this summary. It uses some particular phrasing and words that the typical summarization would not use. So creating a persona is a very common technique that you'll see used when doing summarizations or question and answer, different operations with large language models. So when we think about a novel, right, and that could be different if it's fiction or nonfiction, maybe it's a short story, maybe it's a poem, maybe it's a graphic novel or comic book, maybe it's a medical document, maybe it's an insurance document, maybe it's a legal document. Depending on the content of that long text or that long document, there's probably different types of analysis you're going to want to do. So when you think about a novel, there's a lot of aspects to a novel. So there's the summarization of the novel, but there's other things like who are the main characters? What kind of character types are they? What are the settings? So all of these aspects, when you think of reading a novel, what are all those things that you're looking for in a novel, right? Who are the characters? What type of characters are they? What are the settings? Maybe what are some of the best words to describe this novel? What are the literary devices that are used? And one of those is we can look at the main characters in this prompt. And let me just close this window a little bit so we can see the prompt a little better. So what I've asked for in this case, I said provide a list of the character of each chapter's 3 to 4 main characters. And again, that's arbitrary. And you can see that that's going to vary. The large language model may not always give me 3 or 4, might give me a few more, a few less. And again, that depends on the chapter. Let me know who the main characters are and give me a brief description of each character. And again, giving it some more specific, giving the model, the assistant, which is referring to the model, some more specific orders in order to kind of guarantee that I'm going to get what I want. I asked it to order the main characters by how many times they're mentioned. So what I'd love to get back is if I see Count Dracula or Jonathan Harker at the top, that tells me that they're mentioned in the chapter more than anybody else. This is probably a good chapter if I want to know more about that character. Also introducing 2 new things here. So I have a template. So what I've asked is, hey, when you return these, I want you to number them 1, 2, 3, 4. I want the character name, Count Dracula, Jonathan Harker. And that character doesn't need to be a person. It could be the wolves. There's other characters that are maybe non-human in here. I want you to number that in this exact format. So number, period, character, colon, and then a description of the character. So I've wrapped these in template tags and I've told it to replace these placeholders, which are in square brackets, with the values that you extract from the text. And I've also told it up here, don't include square brackets or XML tags in response. Again, trying to be more specific and precise in my prompt, which will hopefully give me the results that I want. And then I've also included an example here. Now, the one thing that I found can get a little odd, if you give it an example which is also in the book, it then includes that example everywhere. So if I gave an example of Count Dracula, suddenly Count Dracula mysteriously appears in every chapter, even though he may not be in that chapter. So one recommendation I would have based on my experience, if you give an example, give an obscure example that has nothing to do with the document. All you're using that example for is format, not for necessarily content. So again, here, just, the Pink Panther, number 1 Pink Panther, and a little bit of a description of Pink Panther. The Pink Panther is not in the Dracula novel, so we're safe. And then we have the chapter down here. If we take a look here, so if I look at the character descriptions, let's find those. So we have the character descriptions here at the bottom. And we can see that it went through each chapter. So chapter 1, Jonathan Harker is the main character, and he is the main character. If you've read the chapter, he is probably mentioned the most of any of the other characters. We then have Count Dracula, the coach driver who drives Jonathan Harker to Count Dracula's castle, and then the old lady at the hotel. So again, it doesn't need to be an exact person. The large language model has been able to extract 4 characters out. We asked for 3 or 4. It did a pretty good job. We can see here that there was only 3 characters. And again, one of the characters were the 3 women, because the 3 women really don't have individual identities. They're always referred to as the 3 women, or potentially the 3 wives of Dracula. So that makes sense. So that works. So we were able to pull out all these different descriptions. And again, they change as we go through the chapters, and the book continues to evolve and the settings change. We have different characters that get introduced, and we see those coming in here, and they become the main character of that chapter, where maybe other characters were the main character and other chapters are not mentioned because they're not part of this chapter. Results there look pretty good. Let me close that. Do one more. So what I asked here is, I actually named a character. So let me close this up a little bit so we can see the prompt. I said, write a concise, grammatically correct description of the main character, Count Dracula, using only the information within the text tags below. And then within the text tags, again, I've read in the character descriptions that I just showed you, that text file. I've passed that in as the context in the text XML tags here. And what I've asked for is to give me a description of just Count Dracula. So there's probably, 20 to 30 different characters, maybe more, that it pulled out across the 27 chapters. But all I want to know is Count Dracula. Now, here's why I can do that. Let's say of the 27 chapters, Count Dracula probably appears in more than 20 chapters. Let's say 20 chapters. So now I have 20 descriptions of Count Dracula, each one of those extracted from a different chapter. And what I'm asking the large language model to do is consider each one of those individual descriptions of Count Dracula as his character evolves through the novel, and give me a single description of Count Dracula based on those individual chapter level descriptions of Count Dracula. So again, it's a form of summary of summaries, but instead of summarizing the text, what I'm asking it to do is kind of summarize the character. And we can see here, so if we look at the Dracula character description, Dracula, which is the file name that I asked it to output to, and again, all these examples I'm outputting into text files. And we can see here that we got back a one paragraph. Again, I said a concise, grammatically correct output, but I didn't say how long, so it decided a paragraph was enough. I could have asked for more or less, but we got back a paragraph. And we won't go in and read this, but I think if you read it, you'll find it's pretty accurate. It describes Count Dracula and also describes him in the context of the novel, starting in Transylvania, then going to England, and eventually his demise and his impact on other people. So it did a really good job, I think, of summarizing Count Dracula. But instead of reading through all 207,000, 207,000 tokens worth of information in order to create this summary of Count Dracula, it read through maybe less than 1,000 tokens, right? So it read through that individual character descriptions that I extracted from the 27 chapters. I passed that in and I said, just consider the information about Count Dracula in each chapter and then give me an overall summary of Count Dracula. So it did a really good job there, in my opinion. Those are just two examples of summary of summaries, one summarizing the entire context or the text, and another one extracting the main characters and then summarizing one of those main characters. We could have picked Jonathan Harker, we could have picked other characters in the novel. Again, we'll just continue on and look at some similar examples, and we're just going to look at the evolution of our prompts here. So our prompts kind of continue to evolve. So here we're looking at character types. So if you're familiar with character types that are important to a novel, the protagonist, the antagonist, the anti-hero, the sidekicks, the henchmen. Obviously for the Dracula novel, a lot of different henchmen that appear in the novel. The love interest, so the love interest of Count Dracula or Jonathan Harker, the temptress, the confidant, the foil, etc. So these are all very common. I got this list on the internet. And what I'm saying is, for this prompt, here is a list of character types. So I said, instead of saying or assuming that the large language model in its parametric memory knows what a character type is, I want to be able to give it an exact list of character types that I'm interested in. And I want it to consider this when I ask it to show me 3 or 4 examples of each character type in each chapter. So that's what I've done following this list. So again, this is slightly different. It's not necessarily an example. It's not a template. It's just a list to consider. And we'll see that technique being used in another example later on. So based on this list of character types, give me 3 or 4 examples of character types within each chapter. Tell me who that character is. So you can see down here in my template, give me the character name, give me the character type, and then explain why that character portrays this character type. So again, we're getting pretty advanced in terms of what we're asking the large language model. And the reason we're able to do that, or part of the reason, obviously the large language model, the quality of that model is a big determining factor, but also being very precise and detailed in our prompt is going to give us that ability. So continuing with telling the assistant what to do and what not to do. We have the list, we have the template, we have an example. And again, using an example that's not a love interest of Dracula or Jonathan Harker, Minnie Mouse. So again, just showing a format. It didn't even have to be love interest. I did pick one of these, obviously. I wanted to make sure I picked a character that wasn't in the novel. So just use this as an example. I could have given it more than one example. In most of my examples, I'm just giving it one. There's nothing that says you couldn't give it 2 or 3. If you're not getting the results you want to maybe give it a few more examples. That's not uncommon. And again, they're just passing in the chapter. If we look at the character types, and I didn't summarize these. I didn't say, give me a final summary of the novel's main protagonist, Count Dracula. But again, as we kind of go through the novel here, pretty accurate. We have the henchmen, right? So Renfield is certainly one of Dracula's henchmen in the novel, if you're familiar with the novel. We have the love interest of Jonathan Harker. We have the guide and Dr. Stewart. So did a really good job. So this, again, is kind of going beyond just the general summarization of the novel. In this case, we're looking for character types. So hopefully you're getting the idea. And as you see the complexity of these Anthropic Claude V2 specific prompts building in complexity, we can also be more precise in what we get. And we can ask for more advanced concepts from the model to derive from the fictional text. So another example, in this case, we're going to use literary devices. And I'm using the same technique as the character types. But instead of having a bulleted list, which I did in that one, what I wanted to see is if I just did a comma delimited list, would that also work? And in fact, it does. So again, I've given it a list of literary devices because these are the literary devices I want it to use. Within its parametric memory, the model probably certainly understands what a literary device is, and it may or may not have a list that includes these. It may include other ones, but I want it to only consider this list. So I'm telling it to only consider this list. Give me 2 to 3 examples of literary devices found in each chapter. I've given it a very specific template. I want it to use a bulleted list. So in some case, I've told it not to use a bulleted list. In this case, I want a bulleted list. I've told it to give me the literary device and explain why that literary device is applicable to this chapter. And then the results from this, again, we won't go through all the results, but this worked pretty well. I didn't summarize these as well. So you can see here, though, imagery, symbolism, personification, symbolism, metaphor, for. So it did a really good job. It pulled those out. Maybe I could be a little more precise. In these last two cases, I gave it a number. So maybe it's trying a little too hard or not hard enough to find the examples. And you may find that maybe not giving it a number when you're giving it this type of prompt maybe is more exact, or let the model decide whether or not there's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 examples of whatever you've asked for in that text that you've broken apart. Similar example, we can look at settings. Again, just asking it to show me no more than 3 settings and give me a brief description of that setting, right? Settings are critical to a novel, whether we're in Transylvania, whether we're in London, whether we're at the asylum, whether we're in the crypt underneath the church. Very critical to the novel to describe the settings and have these settings for the characters to interact. So I've asked again for a couple settings. So in this case, and just kind of randomly asked it to number the setting, and then I have the setting in the description. And I've also given an example again. I've given an example of Hoboken, New Jersey, which certainly I don't believe is mentioned in the Dracula novel, but again, it kind of gives it an example of how I want it formatted. And you might find that giving it actually more than one example will give a more precise response. So that was the settings. And if we just take a look at those quickly, again, save that out to a text file. The Carpathian Mountains, Count Dracula's Castle. We have London, England, Purfleet, England, the Borgo Pass. So very accurate list. Again, you could read through. Now, here's actually the setting is aboard the Russian schooner Demeter. That's critical to that chapter, chapter 7. Very interesting. Did a really good job. We could look at each one of these and whether or not it's accurate. I think you'll find it based on the temperature that we use. It should be a pretty accurate description. Albeit them very short. If you expected longer descriptions, now whether the chapter itself went into more detail about, let's say, Whitby, England in that chapter, it may or may not have. You could certainly ask for a longer summarization of each setting. But again, we got back what we asked for, and we gave it a fairly specific prompt. In this case, we used a template and an example, which we've seen before. And we were very precise in terms of telling the system what we did or did not want. Moving on, just descriptive adjectives. This is something that wasn't in the post, but I've included in here. So oftentimes, you're asked to describe a novel in terms of phrases or words that best describe that novel. So just another way to kind of describe the Dracula novel, maybe if you were comparing 3 or 4 different novels, how much you describe those. What are the words that you would use to describe this particular text? Another way to kind of look at this, and we see here with the adjectives, again, mysterious, suspenseful, foreboding, haunting, chilling, ominous. Certainly if I were to list these off, it starts painting a picture. Maybe you could even guess what novel this is about, or certainly the genre of novel that this is in. Maybe this sounds maybe like Frankenstein or some other similar novels. It really gives you a sense of, what to expect out of the novel. Even has the format, that's interesting. It even pulled out the narrative technique that the novel is written in, which is absolutely accurate. So it was actually able to determine the narrative technique, or the technique that Bram Stoker used to write the novel, which was popular in that day. And you see other novels written in that format of referencing letters or diaries or different written formats. So in fact, that is the way Dracula is written. It's actually recounted from different written texts, whether those are diaries or letters, etc. Again, did a very good job. Now we could do a summary of summaries. We could say, give me let's say the 10 most common words. So you do see like the word ominous, or maybe foreboding is used more than once. So show me all the words that are used, more than twice. And maybe that gives me a list of 7 or 8 words. And then those are the 8 words that really describe the Dracula novel, for example. So you could do a summary of summaries of the adjectives to really succinctly describe the Dracula novel in a few words or phrases. So just moving on, that was descriptive adjectives. It's generate chapter level questions and answers. This is covered in the blog post. This is also a common technique. So this isn't necessarily summarizing it. Oftentimes what I'm asked for by individuals as I talk to them about Gen AI is they want to create training material or learning material around a long text, creating multiple choice questions or questions and answers around that text, multiple choice, true, false type questions. That's a common use case. And it's a form of summarization because in order to form this question, the large language model needs to understand that text and then be able to extract an answer and then formulate a question. And as we move on, we'll actually formulate a number of answers and only one of those will be correct. But this is a simple question and answer. So I'm saying, here's a template. I have a question. I have an answer. I want you to give me back maybe 6 hypotheticals, maybe a little bit of an odd word. We don't need that. That's kind of extraneous. Just generate a list of 6 questions. So in this case, it can be very specific because we could ask for 2 questions, 6 questions, 10 questions. Most likely the model will be able to extract as many questions as we want out of the novel. So just pick 6 arbitrarily, give me back those, provide the questions and answers. Now the one thing I said is refrain from asking overly broad questions. So I want questions that are easily answered, or not necessarily easy answered, but there is a specific answer to that question. It's a location, it's a character, it's a particular object versus versus a more general question that we could maybe argue whether that answer was precise enough. So give me questions that are not, the answers are not overly broad. Again, don't use bulleted point lists, refrain from square brackets, XML tags. Again, the difference here is really just in the terms of what I'm asking to do, and then having a little bit more maybe of an advanced template here in what I expect back. And then I gave it an example. So, what is the weather like in Spain? The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plains. Just giving an example, a simple example. Again, this kind of fits that not overly broad. The answer is pretty exact, and this is what I expect back. And we can take a look and see if we got that back. So let me just find the questions and answers here. So here's the questions and answers. And we can see we got that back. So what is the setting for the story at the beginning of the chapter? Pretty precise. We know Jonathan Harker was at a hotel and he was on his way to Count Dracula's castle in Transylvania. So pretty good. We won't read through all of these, but you can kind of see that it did a good job. It extracted, up to 6, maybe not always 6, but pretty accurate in the number of 6. Now, one thing I want to call out, if you see these are kind of what I expected back, note this one chapter, and this is where using large language models can be unpredictable. For some reason, for chapter 3, even though I told it don't use the XML tags, it in fact used the XML tags. Now, what's odd about that is it didn't do it in the chapter before, and it didn't do it in the chapter after. Odds are there's certain things that are going to happen, especially in these more complex examples. You may not be able to be precise enough or always guarantee that you're going to get back exactly what you want. Now, it did a pretty good job. This is actually 27 answers. So if you think about this, these are 27 separate answers. And if I just scroll through here, that's, I think, the only one where it got those template tags wrapped around it. Now, again, why did it do that? It got the exact same prompt. It just simply got a different chapter. There's another one. So let's say 2 out of 27. 3, I saw a third one. So 3 out of 27 chapters were wrapped in tags. All the rest weren't, even though it was given the exact same prompt. So again, not always predictable. Maybe if I put the temperature down to 0, I still don't think that probably would have solved it. You could post filter on this. And one thing I would suggest, and I do, is I'll run a regex for any XML tags, and I'll delete those from the final example because there's no reason to have any XML tags in anything that I'm asking it. So even though I've done a pretty good job in the template, and for the most part, again, for 24 out of 27 answers or chapters, it didn't give me tags. For the ones that it did, I'll usually tear those out afterwards using post filtering, and I'll run the text file through a regex and get rid of anything that might have showed up. You're probably never going to get this, especially in these long formats where you're passing through a lot of different documents. You may not get it exactly right. You can't not precisely guarantee that the model is going to respond exactly the same each time. Maybe the models will continue to get better. Maybe a different model might work a little better. The Anthropic Claude 2 model is a very good model, and I think this is probably as good as you're going to get. Again, you could fine tune that prompt, but I did work on this quite a bit. There's some more instruction. Maybe just the way this is worded, right? So for refrain from including square brackets and XML tags, changing just one word here might get rid of those tags. That's where prompt engineering and fine-tuning prompts for large language models and just iterating a large number of tests sometimes is really what's required to get that answer exactly right. But again, close enough for me. It got back what we wanted. Just moving on here, we have another example. Same thing, a little more complex template. So the difference between this one and the last one, if you look in terms of the complexity of the prompt, we're doing multiple choice. So we're not only asking it to find a question in the chapter, analyze the chapter, extract the question, and extract the right answer. We want 4 choices. So not 3 choices, not 5 choices, 4 choices. 3 of those choices are going to be wrong. 1 of those choices are going to be right. So if you think about that, that's a fairly complex ask that we're asking the large language model. Analyze this large text, extract a question, extract the answer, extract 3 probable answers, but 3 answers that are not correct, and then give me that back in a precise format. Again, I use an example here. What color is fresh grass? Hopefully most of that's green, so green. So give an example of what I want back here. It does a good job. Again, we could read each individual one and decide how accurate it is. I have seen the wrong answer come back. By including some of this additional information seems to eliminate that, but there is no guarantee that this is going to work every time. So if I get, let's say, 6 questions back for 27 chapters, there is a possibility that 2% of those, 5% of those, 10% of those may not be right. And this is where each of us as a human has to come in and evaluate those questions and answers and decide whether or not they're good or not. The large language model has done the heavy lifting of extracting all these questions, formatting the template, hopefully getting 3 answers that are close but not right, and then 1 answer that is right. Maybe on a few of those, you have to go back and actually adjust those because they're wrong. So again, don't expect 100% accuracy. The format might be 100% accurate, but that doesn't mean the response is going to be 100% accurate. And again, some of that could be on the interpretation of the novel. Maybe you read it and you believe that this answer is correct, but in a way in which it was ingested by the large language model, it believes the other answer is correct. So again, some of that might be left up to interpretation too, depending on the question. We can take a look at those and see how those look. So here's our multiple choice question and answer. And you can see back that we got a good job. So what was the name of the hotel where Jonathan Harker stops? Bistritz. Probably didn't say that right. But what is the name of that hotel? And in fact, it's saying it's the Golden Krone. And I believe that is correct. And you can see here, so the Golden Krone, the Silver Krone, the Golden Krone Hotel, the Silver Krone Hotel. It is trying to create derivations of the right answer, which are close but not right. What dish did Jonathan Harker eat that he wants to get the recipe for, right? Stuffed pepper, stuffed eggplant, paprika chicken, paprika pork. All those are pretty close. And you could be like, well, he's in Eastern Europe. Those are all probably believable. I'm not an expert on food that was eaten late 1800s in Eastern Europe, but those all seem reasonable. So the answer is not apparent. So it's done a good job of coming up with 3 answers that are close but not right. And then it has the right answer, which is paprika chicken. So it did a pretty good job. If we look at these, I'll just scroll through these quick. It looks like it did a good job. You'll notice some weird formatting, right? So I asked it to give me format, and this isn't critical. Question, 4 answers, and the right answer, right? So in this kind of block of 6 lines, you see here, if we scroll down, suddenly in chapter 2, now put a return between the question, the 4 answers, and the answer, the right answer. You're not going to get 100% precision. Again, it went back to using the format I asked for, but then later on, you'll probably see it switch back to the other format. It actually looks like it did a pretty good job of sticking with that, but a couple chapters where it added an extra line between the choice D and the final answer. So again, it's pretty close. It's probably 95 to 98% of the way there, probably 98% of the way there, but you do see a little variation. Again, you could change a single word in this prompt, and even though that might not make sense, that single word might actually change the entire response, whether that's more accurate or less accurate to what you expected. So again, that's why you really have to do some prompt engineering and really check out the prompts, test the prompts out. Again, you don't have to run it all 27 chapters. Most of these I tested with, let's say, 4 chapters. If I liked the results, then I ran it on all 27. So within like 2 minutes, I was able to get a few responses back. If those responses looked accurate, then I went ahead and spent the 8 or 9 or 10 minutes to run it on all 27 chapters. So I wasn't wasting money or time. I'm going to finish up here with just a few techniques that weren't in the original blog post. So using foundational models to optimize the Anthropic prompts. What I've tried to do, and let me just switch over to the article here, and if we scroll down to the bottom of the article, you can also see there's some great pictures here from Midjourney. So I use the descriptions that I got back from Anthropic, and then I pass those into Midjourney, and some of that's explained in the post, and I have the Midjourney prompts in the post. I was actually able to create some pretty cool graphic novel, Victorian era graphic, Gothic type images using those descriptions. But anyhow, I have some references here. Anthropic has done a great job. They have an introduction to prompt design, and they go through a lot of what you should focus on when you're trying to optimize a prompt specifically for Anthropic. If you were trying to optimize this for Amazon's Titan large language model, for Cohere's model, for AI21, let's say the Jurassic or J2 Ultra model, they also have guides, and the prompt is going to be slightly different in order to optimize it. You could write a very general prompt, but there's some things that are specific to each model which are going to provide more precise response, or the response that you're expecting. And Claude probably has one of the best documentations, how to prompt engineer, how to construct a prompt which is optimized again. So we see the human, the assistant. We see things like how to create placeholders, even how to redact PII, how to create a proper template. They do a really nice job. So I really suggest reading through this. I've tried to implement many of these techniques. I haven't implemented all of these techniques, but what I did is I try to follow this. Now, how can I get those better? One technique that I might be able to use, and again, in some cases it worked, in some cases it didn't, is what if I asked a large language model to take a prompt that I created, pass that into a large language model. When I say a large language model, not any large language model, but maybe what's considered state of the art. So the Anthropic Claude V2, since I'm creating prompts for the model, a natural assumption that I have is, well, what if I ask the model what the best prompt is? The other kind of gold standard obviously is ChatGPT, or the GPT 3.5 or GPT-4 models. Certainly very good models. So the first thing I did is I asked ChatGPT, so using ChatGPT, the chat interface, which is, in this case, I used ChatGPT with the GPT 3.5 large language model. I said, optimize the following prompt written in Python for the Anthropic Claude V2 foundation model. It did modify it. So generally speaking, what I see when I pass these prompts into the large language models like the GPT series or Anthropic Claude V2, the model that I'm actually going to end up prompting, they're shortening the prompt. In this case, what I found when I asked the ChatGPT model, it did a few changes to to it. It really didn't describe, it just said this version of the prompt maintains the same instructions and expectations while being more concise and clear. It really didn't tell you what it did. You can see that it took out some of those specific instructions. If we look at the prompts up here, we had some very specific instructions to the assistant, which is something that's recommended by Anthropic. It actually took those out. The challenge is the results I got back were not as precise. In my experience, again, just with ChatGPT and GPT 3.5, the results that I got back were good. You can see the results here are pretty good. I did get that template, so it didn't fix that problem, and it actually seems like that might have appeared a few more times. So I would say at best, the results are as good as the original prompt, which I try to optimize. What I don't like about it is it removes some of that specific instruction that I gave it to the model, to the assistant, which I do think is important and does seem to be able to more precisely control the response. So I can't say that, although it worked good, I would not use this recommendation because I don't think it's precise enough. The other thing was I took the multiple choice question, the one you just saw for GPT 3.5, and I also took the multiple choice question, so the question and answer and then the multiple choice, and I passed both of those into Claude. Claude has the Claude AI chat interface. Now I could have just called the model through Bedrock, but I was just being a little lazy. You can just log in if you have an account on Anthropic. You can actually, for free, ask Anthropic Claude model through a chat interface. They have a nice chat interface like OpenAI. And I said the same thing, optimize the following prompt written in Python for the Anthropic Claude V2 foundation model. What I really liked about it, now whether the results are better and whether the prompt is better, and I kind of question if the prompt is really better, it doesn't seem to use all the recommendations that are included in the documentation. What I really like is it told me what it did. I won't read all of these, but simplify the instructions, ask for brief specific instructions to avoid broad ones, remove restrictions around bullet points. Now, the reason I was using the restrictions, I don't want bullet points, so I don't necessarily agree with all of these. But what I really liked is when I asked Claude to improve this, not only did it attempt to improve it, it told me what it did. So then I can kind of go back and learn from this. Maybe I don't agree with all these, but even if maybe half of these or 2 or 3 of these bullet points, ways that it saw to improve it, I can incorporate those into my prompts. And that's in fact what I did. So as I've gone back and re-prompt engineered and improved these prompts, I'm using some of the feedback that I get from Claude. You could ask through Bedrock. I was just lazy and didn't want to write the code. So I just actually went into either the ChatGPT interface. And again, I could have called that programmatically, but I used ChatGPT and then I used the Claude AI chat interface, copied and pasted the prompt in along with just a very simple set of instructions. And again, I could have maybe even been more precise in the instructions, but that seemed to be good enough. And I did get responses back, and you can see those in here. So we have those examples here of ChatGPT. We can see the multiple choice. And again, this was based on the optimized quote. I got back the same thing. It did some minor things, like I had these lowercase and they were wrapped in parentheses. It made them uppercase. So some of these choices are very arbitrary. They're not better or worse. For whatever reason, when it rewrote the prompt, it decided to use uppercase ABCD instead of lowercase ABCD. But again, it did follow the format pretty good. So for the most part, it actually seemed to get rid of the problem with wrapping things in the XML tags. So you saw in the original example and even the GPT, it left those XML tags around things. And I think for all of these, it actually got rid of it. So that actually works. It would be worth studying what it did differently, because I was not able to, even following all of the Anthropic instructions, get rid of some of those XML tags that kept popping up in the answers, even though those really are just placeholders. It did something that I was not able to do. Again, it did take a lot of the instructions. Maybe I'm using too many instructions and confusing the model. So what I would take away from this is maybe I need to be more succinct and give it less instruction, and maybe sometimes removing that instruction might actually give me a better answer than trying to provide too much information to the model. And we can see the same thing here. I passed in the multiple choice, which I just showed you, versus the question and answered. Again, it gave me back really nice instructions, so I really like that. That's a definitely technique I would recommend, whether you use it or not, is once you write your prompt, then choose whatever you think is the gold standard. I would recommend asking the model that you're actually going to be prompting. So in this case, although GPT 3.5 and 4 through ChatGPT interface are excellent models, if you're writing prompts for those models, maybe you want to ask those models, in this case using Anthropic Claude or specifically Claude V2, asking that model, prompting that model to improve your prompt is probably your best logical choice. I would recommend this technique just to, if nothing else, to kind of test your prompt and see if you can improve it, or at least see what the model recommends. And then at minimum, maybe you take away 1 or 2 key points. So that's the end of this video. That follows along again with the blog post, which is both on Medium and on LinkedIn. So if you don't have a Medium account, you can get on LinkedIn. And then all of the code that I just went through is all updated and on GitHub. Would really appreciate it if you want to follow me on YouTube or Medium, if you want to like the post on LinkedIn, and feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn. I try to connect to everybody on LinkedIn and would love to connect to you and also get your feedback. And if you have any suggestions on how to further enhance this, really trying to create a well-documented approach here in this library that can be repurposed and reused by a lot of individuals. Thank you for your time.